The wind howled like a banished soul across the barren lands, but it could not drown out a cry that was even more desperate. It was the cry of a tiny being about to fade away from 2 days without milk. Wyatt Calder clutched the swaddled bundle to his chest, each of the child's sobs a knife twisting into the oath he had sworn over his wife's grave. He rode into Redemption Hollow, a name that felt like a mockery for a man who had lost everything, except a child he did not know how to save. The stinging wind swept across the barren land, carrying a mournful hiss through the gaunt frames of cacti. The dust was a blinding curtain, stinging Wyatt Calder's eyes like invisible needles. He tightened his grip on the reins, one hand steering the exhausted horse, the other clutching the swaddled bundle to his chest, as if it were his last possession on earth. Inside the fabric, the sobs of a tiny being carved new scratches onto his already tattered soul. He entered Redemption Hollow. As dusk spilled a bruised, purple stain across the horizon, the town's name rang out like a bitter mockery. Leaning wooden shacks cast long shadows on the single dirt road, seeming to buckle under the weight of time and violence. The empty window frames, black with soot, looked like dead eye sockets. The air was thick with the smell of old gunpowder, cheap liquor, and hardened despair. Wyatt dismounted in front of the general store, every joint in his body screaming in protest. Exhaustion was a venom, seeping deep into his veins. The baby in his arms stirred, then let out a sharp cry, loud enough to make a few bowed heads on the opposite porch look up. Wyatt cleared his throat, trying to muster what little dignity he had left. "Need some milk?" His voice was a raw rasp, directed at a broad-shouldered cattleman nearby. The man, with a matted beard and a mouth stained yellow from chewing tobacco, stared him down from head to toe. Then he spat a wad of brown juice onto the ground. "No milk here, stranger. Try your luck at the saloon." Wyatt's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. He turned toward the saloon, from which stumbled the sound of an out-of-tune piano and dry, crackling laughter. He pushed open the 2 creaking doors, stepping into a suffocating world, slick with spilled liquor and human heat. All eyes turned to him, an outsider, face smeared with grime, eyes wild, clutching a screaming infant like a gunslinger holding his dying partner. "What in the hell is this?" A voice called from the bar. Wyatt walked straight toward it, every step stiff with the clash of pride and shame. "My son," he said, his voice barely audible. "He needs milk. It's been 2 days." The bartender, a wiry man with a crooked mustache, glared at him. "We only serve hard liquor here, not wet nurses." "I have money." Wyatt placed $2 silver on the wooden counter. It was all he had left. "Powdered milk, canned goat's milk, anything. Can't help you." The baby's cry rose again, sharp, desperate. Wyatt swallowed hard. A man sitting nearby chuckled. "Got some nerve, waltzing in here with a babe and no woman." Wyatt turned, slow and dangerous. "She's gone." The room fell silent for a beat. Then the bartender shrugged. "Not my business. Best take that child and get out of here before folks get antsy." Wyatt picked up his 2 silver coins. He had just noticed one was stained with dried blood. He turned and walked out. The door slapped shut behind him like the fall of a judge's gavel. Outside, the sun had sunk completely behind the mountains, leaving only a faint purple glow that could soothe. Nothing. He leaned against his horse, his heart hammering in his chest. The baby's cries were weaker now, no longer fierce, but merely fatigued. That scared him more than the hunger. "I promised your mother I'd take care of you," he whispered, "but I truly don't know how." He pressed his lips to the baby's forehead. His skin was burning hot. He was not alone in the night. A figure had been standing there for some time, watching quietly from the porch of a building that looked more like a barn than a home. It was a woman. Her face was marked with a firmness that only this land could sculpt: sturdy cheekbones, eyes that looked straight on, without a trace of fluctuation. "What the boy needs I have," her voice rang out, not loud but clear, cutting through the hiss of the wind. The reflex of a hunted man arose. Wyatt's hand was on the grip of his revolver before reason could intervene. He narrowed his eyes into the darkness, searching for a sign of threat. The woman did not move. "You can put that away," she said, her voice even. "I don't invite men. I have to be wary of into my home." "I can pay," Wyatt rasped, his vigilance still intact. "I wasn't asking." She replied, and then, without another word of explanation, she turned and walked into the barn, leaving behind a rectangular patch of pale yellow light spilling from the doorway. Wyatt stood rooted to the spot, torn between the suspicion that was etched into his very bones and the despair that was gnawing at him. But then the baby in his arms whimpered again, a weak, broken sound. The choice had been made for him. He followed her. The air inside was not the smell of despair and violence like the outside. It was the smell of dried thyme, of candle wax and clean wood. The woman was moving with a calm and purposeful grace, pulling an armchair closer to the hearth, where logs were crackling. She removed a thick shawl, revealing a blouse that had been loosened, ready. Wyatt froze, the sudden intimacy of the moment paralyzing him. It was too private, too raw. "The boy needs to eat," she said, her simple words cutting through all his hesitation. She sat down in the chair and held out her arms. "Give him to me." He turned his face away as he handed her the bundle, a gesture of half shame, half gratitude. "He's not used to strangers." "But I am no stranger to hunger," she replied. She took the baby, adjusted her hold expertly, and then began to nurse him. The child rooted, instinct taking over, and latched onto his source of life greedily. The sound that came next, a steady, content suckling, then a sigh of relief it pierced Wyatt's defenses more powerfully than a bullet. He turned his face into the shadows, his jaw clenched to hold back some rising emotion. Her voice came, softer now. "What's his name?" "Matthew," Wyatt answered, his voice hoarse. She named him. The woman nodded, not asking more. She looked down at the child with something akin to reverence. "I had a son once," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of years. Wyatt looked up, meeting her gaze. Her eyes were clear and still, holding more truth than anything he had heard in weeks. "The fever took him in a single night," she went on. "He's buried under the willow tree out back. I'm sorry." "People say you shouldn't speak of sad things," she said. "But people say all sorts of things." They sat in silence. It was no longer a heavy silence, but one filled with an understanding that needed no words, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the soft sounds of a child being sated. Dawn seeped through the cracks of the barn walls, painting streaks of honey-yellow light onto the dusty floor. Wyatt awoke not to a heart-rending cry, but to the faint smell of baking bread in the air and a softly hummed melody, a tune that was part lullaby, part lament. He sat up, the muscles in his body stiff from the first deep sleep in weeks. A habit etched deep in his subconscious made his hand seek the cold revolver beside him. Next to the gun, Matthew lay peacefully in his wool blanket, his small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. For the first time in days, the baby's silence was not a sign of exhaustion, but of peace. Below, Rosalie was kneading dough on a worn wooden table. The early light highlighted the curve of her neck and the hidden strength in her forearms. Every movement of hers exuded a calmness, as if she wasn't just making a loaf of bread, but performing an ancient ritual to ward off the darkness. Wyatt climbed down the ladder, his boots landing softly on the floor, not wanting to break this fragile moment. "You slept as if you've never slept before," Rosalie said, her eyes still on the dough. "I used to sleep with one eye open. You don't need to here." She nodded, wiped her hands on a cloth, and poured him a cup of coffee from a blackened tin pot. "It's not fresh, but it's strong." He took it, nodding his thanks. Matthew began to stir, then let out a soft coo. Rosalie reflexively moved to go to him, but Wyatt stopped her. "Let me." She stood still, watching him lift the baby. His fingers were broad and calloused, looking clumsy as they held the small form, yet they possessed a gentleness that he himself didn't realize he had. "You've never done this before, have you?" she asked. "There was no need," Wyatt replied. "We thought we had more time." Rosalie didn't ask what happened. Some wounds didn't need to be reopened with words. Loss had a face that everyone could recognize. By mid-morning, Wyatt stepped outside to tend to his horse. The sky stretched vast and merciless over the prairie. As he was brushing the animal down, a figure on horseback appeared in the distance, trailing a faint plume of dust. Wyatt narrowed his eyes. The rider's posture was too confident, his path too straight. Rosalie came out of the barn, still wiping, her hands on her apron. Her breath caught when she recognized the newcomer. "It's Clem," she said, her voice flat, but Wyatt could hear the faint tremor within it. The rider reined in his black horse, a showy and arrogant gesture. A smile bloomed on his lips, but his eyes were as cold as two pieces of stone. He dismounted, every movement exuding a defiant self-satisfaction. "I thought you would have withered." "Away by now, Rosalie," he said, his voice a mocking drawl. "Don't call me by that name, Clem," Rosalie answered, her voice level but sharp. Clem's gaze slid past her, then settled on Wyatt and the bundle in his arms. His smile widened. "Now I see. Didn't know you had a hobby of picking up other people's leftovers. A war veteran with a bastard child." Wyatt took a step forward, placing himself between Clem and Rosalie. "You have business here?" Clem laughed. A contemptuous sound. "Easy there, friend. I'm just visiting an old acquaintance, though it seems she's found a new amusement." "What do you want, Clem?" Rosalie cut in, her voice hardening. Only then did Clem turn his full attention to Wyatt. He circled him, his gaze appraising, like a horse trader. "I heard a familiar name was drifting around Redemption Hollow. Came to see if the rumors were true." He stopped, facing Wyatt. "Wyatt Calder, isn't it? Rode with Flint Bragg's crew in the range dispute 3 winters back." Wyatt didn't blink. "I rode then. I stopped." "Oh, people say otherwise," Clem sneered. "People say you didn't stop soon enough. They rumor that it was your own hand that lit the torch that burned down old Preacher Grady's farm, with his boys still inside." "That's a lie. Maybe so, maybe not," Clem shrugged. "But the point is, people remember. This town might forgive. Few sins, but not murder. Especially not the murder of children." "That's enough," Rosalie interjected, her voice like ice. Clem tipped his hat slowly, mockingly. "Be seeing you, Rosalie. And you, Calder, don't go getting too comfortable." He mounted his horse and rode off, leaving behind the fading sound of hooves and an atmosphere thick with suspicion. Wyatt exhaled a heavy breath, his hands clenched into fists without him realizing it. "You know him," he said, more a statement than a question. Rosalie looked at him, her eyes heavy. "Know him well enough to understand he never shows up unless he wants something." "What did he want today?" She looked him straight in the eye. "To make sure the past never stays buried." The air that night was heavy, suffocating like before a storm. Clem was gone, but his venom had seeped into every timber of the barn, into every silence between the two of them. Rosalie nursed Matthew, her face as still as a lake's surface, betraying no ripple of emotion. Wyatt paced near the window, his ears strained, trying to distinguish the sound of the wind from other hostile noises. "That fire... Rosalie said suddenly, breaking the silence. "It wasn't you, was it?" Wyatt stopped, his back to her. "No." A single word, but it held the weight of 3 years. "I believe you," she replied. That simple faith made something inside Wyatt collapse. He admitted, his voice a mumble, "I was there. I tried to stop Flint, but he wouldn't listen. By the time I pulled the boys out, the roof was already coming down, only saved one." He turned to face her, his eyes marked with old pain. "That's why I left. I couldn't look their mother in the eye anymore." "You can't outrun guilt forever," Rosalie said softly. "Maybe, but not today." Silence fell again, but this time it was not heavy, but filled with a shared understanding. Outside, there was the crunch of footsteps on gravel, then angry voices muffled by the distance. Clem was planting his seeds. Wyatt and Rosalie looked at each other and without a word slipped out into the darkness. 3 men were standing in front of the saloon, Clem in the middle, a bottle in his hand. They were stirring up the wolves. "They'll come here," Wyatt whispered. "We should leave." "No," Rosalie's voice was firm. "This is my home. I'm done running too." The next morning, the verdict was delivered, nailed to the wooden post in front of the sheriff's office. A white piece of paper fluttered in the wind like a broken butterfly. On it, Wyatt's face was crudely sketched, tired and wild. And below it were the black, cruel letters, "Wanted Wyatt Calder, $500, dead or alive." Wyatt stood frozen, feeling as if the ground had just fallen out from under him. Rosalie stood beside him, her hands clenched into fists. "Where did that paper come from?" he asked, his voice not his own. "Does it matter?" He looked at her, despair rising in his eyes again. "I have to go. I'm putting you and Matthew in danger." "You're not going anywhere," she shook her head. "Not like this. I'm not worth anyone dying for." Rosalie turned, looking him straight in the eye, her own gaze burning with intensity. "This boy doesn't think so." She paused, then continued. "And I'm starting not to think so either." Something inside Wyatt's chest broke. Not pain, something closer to hope. Back at the barn, Matthew cried again, but this time it wasn't a cry of desperation, just one of hunger. Rosalie moved to pick him up, but Wyatt stepped forward first. "Let me." She stepped back, watching him hold the baby, rocking him gently with a rhythm he didn't know he possessed. Outside, the wind still carried dust and the scent of trouble, but inside, for the first time, he was not alone to face it. Night fell on Redemption Hollow, bringing with it a heavy, threatening silence. The whole town was an enemy now. The furtive glances, the whispers that died when Wyatt passed, they all formed an invisible net that was tightening around the barn. Wyatt couldn't sleep. He lay on the straw bed in the loft, listening to Matthew's steady breathing, his revolver within arm's reach. Fitful dreams pulled him back to another life, a life with his wife's smile, where she was holding Matthew and there were no ghosts lurking at the end of the road. He would wake up in a cold sweat, the pain clawing at him like a hungry animal. He climbed down the ladder. In the flickering firelight, Rosalie was also awake. She sat in the armchair, not reading or sewing. She was sharpening a kitchen knife on a whetstone. The sound of steel on stone, a steady, cold, and purposeful melody, filled the quiet space. "The dreams," Wyatt said, his voice hoarse, "they don't let go." "I know," Rosalie replied, her eyes not leaving the blade. "In my dreams, I still see my son running through the fields. His laughter is louder than the wind. Then I wake up, and there is only silence." She paused, looking at the cold steel blade. "Grief never disappears, Wyatt. It just eats deep into your marrow, becoming a part of you. The only way to survive is to hold on tight to what's left, and not let this world take anything more." The next morning, her words were proven true. The blacksmith refused to shoe Wyatt's horse. The clerk at the feed store just grunted and turned away. Clem's venom had spread everywhere. "He won't stop," Wyatt said upon returning to the barn. "He'll use you and the boy to get to me. I have to face him." "Walk into that trap alone?" Rosalie looked straight at him. No, your past is our present now." Before her words had faded, the barn door creaked open. In an instant, they both moved. Wyatt had his gun out. Rosalie had grabbed the shotgun propped in the corner. But the person at the door was not Clem. It was a boy, perhaps only 16, scrawny, with a mop of blonde hair and eyes wide with fear. "My pa," the boy stammered, his hands on his head. "He's with Clem. They're planning something for tonight." Behind the saloon, Wyatt lowered his gun, stepping closer. "Why are you telling us this?" The boy looked down. "Because Clem is wrong. And my ma says the sins of adults shouldn't be borne by a child." Wyatt nodded. "What's your name?" "Jonah." "Thank you, Jonah. Now go home." The boy turned and fled into the night, as fast as a shadow. Rosalie turned to Wyatt. "We have to act." Wyatt's voice was as cold as the freshly sharpened knife blade. "We will." 2 in the morning. The town was sunk in a drunken, forgetful sleep. Wyatt and Rosalie glided through the alleys, two shadows merging as one with the night. They moved without a sound, each understanding their role without a word exchanged. Lantern light flickered out from behind the saloon, staining the faces yellow and making the cold steel of gun muzzles glint. Clem was there, with 4 of his cronies. His voice was low and self-satisfied as he laid out his plan. Wyatt signaled for Rosalie to stay in the shadows, her shotgun a silent promise. Then he stepped out from his hiding place, walking straight into the small courtyard. His appearance brought the conversation to an abrupt halt. Clem turned, and when he recognized Wyatt, a malicious smile spread across his lips. "Look which sewer rat has crawled out of its hole." Wyatt didn't respond to the taunt. He stopped a few paces away, his entire being a deadly focus. "You wanted blood, Clem. I'm here." Clem spread his arms wide in a theatrical gesture of magnanimity. "How noble. But it's too late to play the hero, Calder." "I'm not here for speeches," Wyatt said, his voice ice cold. "Let's end this." Clem moved first, a blurred motion of his hand toward his holster. But Wyatt didn't react. He simply acted. A single gunshot exploded, dry and brutal, tearing the night apart. Clem froze, the smile on his lips stiffening. He looked down in disbelief at his chest, where a small hole was beginning to spread into a dark stain. "You ... he stammered. "You shot me." Wyatt took a step forward, the gun in his hand still not lowered. "The reign of men like you," he said, "ends here." Clem crumpled to his knees, then collapsed to the ground. The 4 remaining men stood motionless, stunned, not one of them daring to draw. A silence fell over the alley, heavier than the gunshot that had just ended. From the shadows, Rosalie stepped out, the shotgun in her hands aimed squarely at them. "You have 2 choices," her voice was steel. "Follow him, or get the hell out of here now." The men looked at each other, then at Clem's body. Fear won out over loyalty. One by one, they backed away, then melted into the darkness. Wyatt stood there for a long moment. Then he holstered his gun, for the first time in years. His hand did not tremble. The invisible burden had been shed along with that single bullet. The next dawn, Redemption Hollow held its breath. The death of Clem Ryder had left a silent void. Now when Wyatt passed, people no longer looked at him with contempt. Instead, it was something more complex: wariness, a little fear, and perhaps a begrudging sliver of respect. Wyatt didn't care. He wasn't looking for their approval. He only wanted silence, the silence he found in the barn, where Matthew was gnawing on his own fingers and letting out little gurgles of laughter. For the first time, Wyatt looked at his son and felt a complete love, unmixed with the bitter taste of guilt. He turned to look at Rosalie, who was mending one of his shirts, and a strange warmth, a sense of belonging, crept into him. That peace did not last. At noon, another rider entered town. This one was not loud like Clem. He rode straight to the sheriff's office, handed over an envelope, and left as soon as his horse had taken a few sips of water. A few minutes later, Sheriff Nolan Tate, a man who had long ago traded justice for a quiet life, came looking for Wyatt. "This is for you," Nolan said, his voice tired, holding out a letter with the seal of the U.S. Marshals. Wyatt read it. Once, then a second time. He let out a long breath. An official investigation was coming. 3 days later, Marshal Silas Gray arrived. He was a man carved from gravel and long miles. His hair was silver white, and his eyes were the gray of a winter sky, reflecting nothing but the naked truth. He came alone, but his presence was enough to make the entire town fall silent. The interrogation took place in Nolan's cramped office. Gray wasted no time. "You shot Clem Ryder," he said, a statement of fact. "Yes." "Why?" He drew first. "Was there any provocation?" "He put a bounty on my head. He threatened the woman who took me and my son in." Gray nodded, writing nothing down. "The records show you are still wanted in some territories for your connection to the Flint Bragg gang." "I know," Wyatt replied. "But I wasn't the one who lit that fire, and I saved a boy from it." Silas Gray looked at Wyatt for a long moment, his gray eyes seeming to pierce through his defenses. Then he closed his notebook. "I believe you," he said, surprising both Wyatt and Nolan. He continued, his voice unchanged. "But the law doesn't operate on belief, Calder. It operates on paper and proof." Wyatt stood up. "So what's next?" "I will file my report. Recommend the charges be dropped, but that is not a promise." Gray looked him straight in the eye. "You don't look like a murderer, Calder. You look like a man who is too tired of running from graves he never dug." The marshal left that very night. The weight of the law had been lifted, but the air was still tinged with uncertainty. And in the darkness of an alley, a man once loyal to Clem Ryder clutched a knife in his pocket, his eyes burning with hatred. The storm was not over yet. Peace was like a thin layer of ice on a deep lake, beautiful but liable to break at any moment. For a few days after the marshal left, Wyatt began to work, mending the broken-down fences at the edge of town. He worked under the harsh sun, sweat and dust caking his skin. Every post he drove into the ground was not just to fence in cattle, but to fence in a new life. In the evenings, he would sit on the porch with Rosalie, listening to the insects in the night and the soft sound of Matthews breathing from inside. "Did you ever think you'd live this long?" she had once asked. "Never planned on it," he'd replied. "Well, do you think you deserve it?" He looked at her, at the warmth of the barn and the small form sleeping soundly. "I think I need to." But that night, the thin ice broke, a sickly orange. Light devoured the darkness, followed by screams. Fire. The flames crawled out of the general store, red tongues licking the air, roaring. Wyatt was the first to run toward it, without a moment's hesitation. He grabbed buckets of water, throwing them at the growling beast, the heat scorching his face and black smoke filling his lungs. Gradually, other townsfolk rushed out, their initial fear giving way to a common effort to save what was left of their town. They put out the fire, but half the building had been turned to ash. Inside, amidst the smoldering timbers, a message had been left. Carved deep into the countertop with the tip of a knife were the crude, hateful letters. "Blood must be paid with blood." Rosalie stared at the words, her face pale. "It's Clem's men." "Sheriff." Nolan shook his head wearily. "You've chopped off the snake's head, Calder, but its tail is still thrashing." That night, in the barn, Wyatt took out his revolver again. He cleaned it in silence. But this time, it was not in preparation for a defense. It was in preparation for a declaration of war. "Are you going somewhere?" Rosalie asked, her voice worried. "No," he replied. "I'm drawing a line." The next morning, Wyatt nailed a piece of paper to the very post that had once held his wanted poster. The paper had only a few words, written in a hard, determined hand. I am here. No fire. Nitrogen monoxide shadows. Come. Here. The entire town silently read the challenge. No one answered, but Wyatt knew they had heard. He was no longer running or waiting. He was standing in the middle of the road, under the sun, and waiting for them to come. The wait lasted a week. A heavy week when every long shadow at dusk could be an enemy. Every hiss of wind through the barn walls could be a threat. But no one came. Wyatt's challenge hung in the air, an oath made of paper and ink. Then late. One afternoon, as the sun began to sink, a cloud of dust appeared at the end of the road. 4 riders. They didn't enter the town, but stopped at the edge of the fields, silent black silhouettes against the reddening sky. One man separated from the group, riding alone toward the barn. He did not draw his gun. Wyatt stepped out to meet him, his hand resting lightly on his holster. "You're Calder," the man said, his voice hoarse with road dust and hatred. "I am. Clem was my brother." Wyatt said nothing. There were no words to be said. "I don't want a slaughter," the man continued. "Just you and me, at Black Rock at sunset." "Agreed." Wyatt nodded. The sunset bloodied the entire western sky, like a giant open wound. Wyatt stood at Black Rock, facing Clem's brother. Between them were 10 paces and a debt that could not be erased. The wind blew hard, carrying the solitude of the prairie. There were no challenges, no taunts. Only the heavy silence of 2 men who knew that only one would leave this place when night fell. They both drew. 2 shots exploded almost at the same time, but there was a delay just long enough to decide their fates. Wyatt felt a sharp searing pain in his arm, but he remained standing. The other man staggered, the gun falling from his hand. He dropped to his knees, clutching his chest. Wyatt walked over, standing over his dying enemy. "He wasn't worth it," Wyatt said, his voice not triumphant, but filled with a bitter truth. "He wasn't worth you dying for." The light in the man's eyes faded, but it seemed he gave a faint nod before he breathed his last. When Wyatt returned to the barn, darkness had fallen. Rosalie ran out to meet him, her eyes scanning him and stopping on the bloodstain on his arm. "You're hurt." "I'll be fine," he said, his voice weary. From her arms, Matthew reached for him, letting out a clear, gurgling laugh. Wyatt took the baby, holding him close, feeling the warmth and the weight of life. He buried his face in his son's soft hair. "It's over," he whispered. "Is it really over?" Rosalie asked, her voice a mixture of hope and a fear that had lasted too long. Wyatt looked up. He looked at her, then at the child in his arms. He looked out at the fields under the moonlight, at the barn, the sanctuary that had become his home. "It's over," he affirmed, this time for real. Wyatt Calder stood there, no longer a ghost hunted by the past, no longer a fugitive or a gunslinger. He was a father, a partner, a man reborn from the ashes. The Wild West had not broken him. It had forged him, and for the first time in his life, Wyatt was no longer running. He was home.